Welcome back to Harbor Unboxed. A few days ago now, I revisited AMD's Ryzen 7 1700 and found that the now 3-year-old processor had aged rather well. When compared to its direct competition at the time, the Core i7 7700K, the 8-core 16-thread Ryzen processor enjoyed strong performance gains in almost all the applications tested, often beating the Intel processor by an almost 40% margin, whereas it was only around 10% slower in the few instances where it came off second best. As for gaming, the situation has improved, but even so, for the most part, the Ryzen processor did trail the Intel quad-core. Still, when you consider the fact that 3 years ago, the 7700K was around 20% faster on average, and today that margin has shrunk quite considerably to around 5%, it's clear that as games continue to become more demanding, we are approaching a point where the R7 1700 and its many more cores will become the superior choice even for gamers. But for many of you, that won't really matter, because by the time processors like the 7700K are no longer sufficient for modern games, you'll have likely already upgraded to something better. So the fact that the Intel CPU was the superior gaming choice back in 2017 and arguably still is in 2020 means that those who bought it specifically for gaming made the right choice. Though, as I noted in the last video, waiting a little bit longer for the 8700K would have been a much better option, but of course that is the benefit of hindsight. Anyway, having revisited the Ryzen 7 1700 and compared it with the Core i7 7700K in 2020, it's clear for those running productivity tasks that can utilize the extra cores, the Ryzen processor was a much better buy. For gaming though, they both do work well, but if you're investing in a high-end graphics card for high refresh rate gaming, then the Intel processor was the way to go. But what about now, midway through 2020? Is a second-hand Ryzen 7 1700 something you should still entertain buying? This question was recently put to us in our monthly Q&A series. A viewer pointed out that for the same money, roughly $120 to $130 US, they had the option of either a brand new Ryzen 3 3300X or a second-hand Ryzen 7 1700 and wondered which would be the best choice for gaming. This question caused me to pause and really think about the options. The 3300X is a 4-core 8-thread processor that enjoys numerous performance and efficiency advantages of the Zen 2 architecture, while the 1700 is an 8-core 16-thread processor based on the original and slower Zen architecture. The 1700 might have twice as many cores and therefore at the same price appear to be the more obvious choice, but the cores are quite a bit slower. Looking over the productivity data, we see that the 1700 is at best on par with the 6-core 12-thread Ryzen 5 3600, and in some instances was a little over 20% slower, and even the 3.9 GHz overclock couldn't completely close the gap. That said, it was always at least 15% faster than the 3300X, so in many instances the 1700 performed between the 3300X and the 3600 in modern applications. Then when it came to gaming performance, the 3300X was on average 15% faster, so can we just declare the 3rd gen quad-core as the best option for gamers? I'm not really sure about that, and here's why. Yes, the 3300X is for the most part technically faster in today's games, and I say technically because we are comparing performance with an extremely high-end graphics card that virtually no Ryzen 7 1700 or Ryzen 3 3300X owner will use. I think it's fair to say a more likely pairing would be something like the Radeon RX 5700 or GeForce RTX 2060, and when using these $300-ish GPUs, will there actually be a difference in gaming performance between these CPUs? Well, this is something I plan to address in today's video. Also, assuming that you're going to keep either CPU for the next 3 to 4 years, does it matter how they perform in today's games with a $1,000 plus GPU that you'll never use? Because in 3 to 4 years' time, when you have access to RTX 2080 Ti-like performance at a reasonable price, and games are potentially utilizing 8-core 16-thread processors, the performance advantage observed today with the 3300X won't necessarily translate into future gains. Typically, we make our product recommendations based on facts and figures, the evidence available at the time of review, and therefore we do shy away from trying to make future predictions or any kind of promises, unless of course they are blatantly obvious. In the case of the Ryzen 3 3300X and Ryzen 7 1700, I feel as though we do need a bit more data to work out which is the best investment moving forward, so therefore I've added the 1st gen Ryzen processor to our GPU scaling data to see how they compare using a range of GPUs and quality presets. presets. As for the test system, I'm using the Gigabyte X570 Aorus Master motherboard, 32GB of G-Skills Flarex DDR4 3200CL14 memory, and the Corsair H115i Pro all-in-one liquid cooler. And please note that the same memory and cooler configuration has been used to test all CPUs. Okay, let's get into the results. Starting with one of the worst titles for Ryzen processors, particularly first-gen Ryzen, we have Far Cry New Dawn. As you can see, using the medium quality preset, which is labeled normal, we're heavily CPU bound when using not just the GeForce RTX 2080 Ti, but also the RTX 2070 Super and even the RTX 2060. Here the 3300X is up to 26% faster when comparing the average frame rate and 17% faster for the 1% lows. That is obviously quite a substantial margin. It means the Ryzen 7 1700 is heavily limiting game performance with anything faster than a GTX 1650 Super. So a disappointing result, but Far Cry New Dawn is, as I said, a worst case scenario, particularly for first gen Ryzen, and it certainly doesn't call for more than a quad core with SMT support. In fact, the 3300X only saw peak utilization hit 65%, with 55% being the average, and that meant the R7 1700 peaked at just 40%, but typically we saw utilization hovering around 30%. And even with the ultra quality settings enabled, the GTX 1650 Super is about as fast as you can go with the 1700 before it becomes the primary performance limiting component. Rainbow Six Siege is a much better title for first-gen Ryzen processors, and here we're seeing the 1700 stick with the 3300X, using not only the GTX 1650 Super, but also the RTX 2060 and even the RTX 2070 Super for the most part when using the medium quality settings at 1080p. The 1700 creates a serious CPU bottleneck with the RTX 2080 Ti, and here the 3300X was up to 34% faster. That is another big margin, though I do wonder how relevant it is given that the first gen Ryzen processor ensured a minimum of 240 FPS was rendered during our test. Maxing out the quality preset doesn't change too much, though we're now seeing little to no difference between the 1700 and 3300X using the GeForce RTX 2070 Super. Still, this is a good result overall, and Rainbow Six Siege does a fairly good job of utilizing the 8-core processor, with CPU utilization typically hovering around 60%, with peaks as high as 80% when using the RTX 2080 Ti. That's compared to a peak of 90% with the 3300X and an average utilization of 75%. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is another title that heavily utilizes 6 and 8-core processors, so it was no surprise to see CPU utilization for the 3300X peak at 97%, with an average utilization of 90% during our testing with the highest quality settings, though please note here we are looking at the medium quality results. The Ryzen 7 1700 on the other hand has a little more headroom, but even so it still peaked at 80% and averaged 70%, which makes sense given it typically sits somewhere between the 3300X and 3600 for productivity performance. But the main takeaway being that we see close performance between the 3300X and 1700 in another CPU demanding title. Using dialed down quality settings, the 3300X was up to 9% faster when using the RTX 2080 Ti, 7% faster with the RTX 2070 Super, and then we see comparable performance with the RTX 2060 and GTX 1650 Super. Increasing the quality preset does increase the CPU load, and now the older 8-core Ryzen processor is starting to edge ahead when looking at the all-important 1% low performance. Here the 1700 was up to 7% faster, and it maintains that lead even with the RTX 2070 Super. Of course, once again dropping down to the RTX 2060 neutralizes the results, and naturally we see the same thing with the GTX 1650 Super. Gears Tactics, much like Far Cry New Dawn, is another game where first-gen Ryzen processors perform quite poorly, at least relative to Intel's Core series and AMD's own third generation of Ryzen processors. We're still seeing over 90 FPS at all times, with averages well above 100 FPS, so for this kind of game that's more than enough performance, but it is crazy to see the 3300X up to 43% faster with the RTX 2080 Ti, and even up to 37% faster with the RTX 2070 Super. In fact, even with the GTX 1650 Super, we're still seeing a drop-off for the 1% low performance. I think it's fair to say this game doesn't suit the R7 1700 very well, and I saw an average CPU utilization of just 25% when using the ultra quality preset with a peak of 50%. The 3300X on the other hand averaged 45% with a peak utilization of 80%. So the higher clocked, more modern quad core is better suited here. Still, we at least find when increasing the quality preset to Ultra that the 1700 is able to match the 3300X with the GTX 1650 Super as the game becomes GPU bound. That wasn't quite the case with the RTX 2060, though we are pretty close here. Next up, we have World War Z, and starting with the 1080p medium data, we see that the Ryzen 7 1700 again struggles with the faster RTX 2080 Ti and RTX 2070 Super GPUs, trailing the 3300X by up to a 23% margin. In fact, this is another title that doesn't see the R7 1700 match the 3300X until we heavily limit frame rate performance with the GTX 1650 Super. The problem here for the R7 1700 is that World War Z isn't able to take full advantage of the 8-core processor, as we saw an average CPU utilization of just 30%, with peaks topping out at 45%. The 3300X, on the other hand, averaged 60% utilization, with peaks as high as 80%. Increasing the visual quality did create enough of a GPU bottleneck when using the RTX 2060 that allowed the 1700 to deliver the same level of performance, but once again we're seeing the first gen Ryzen processor slip behind with the faster RTX 2070 Super and 2080 Ti. Last up, we have the Borderlands 3 results, and this is yet another title that didn't fully utilize the Ryzen 7 1700, not even close. In fact, in our test pass, we saw an average utilization of just 30% with a peak of 35%. Granted, this isn't the most CPU demanding title, but we did see much higher utilization with the 3300X, peaking at 55% with an average of 45%. Again, the R7 1700 slips behind the RTX 2070 Super and 2080 Ti, but this time it is able to max out the RTX 2060 and therefore the GTX 1650 Super. It's also worth noting that with the higher end GPUs, we're seeing well over 130 FPS at all times. Increasing the visual quality with the Ultra preset allowed the 1700 to match the 3300X right up to the 2070 Super, while it was just 7% slower with the 2080 Ti. So in most well-optimized games that aren't particularly CPU demanding, these kinds of results are what you'd expect to see. Now here's a quick look at the average performance across the half dozen games tested, and I have to say this paints a pretty poor picture for the Ryzen 7 1700, as it was up to 9% slower than the 3300X, even with the RTX 2060, and that margin balloons out to 22% with the RTX 2080 Ti. The Ultra quality results do look considerably better, and here it's really only the 2080 Ti configuration where the 1700 trails by a sizable margin. Still, it's quite clear that the 3300X is the superior gamer, at least for now. Okay, so we've now gone over all the GPU scaling data comparing the Ryzen 7 1700 and Ryzen 3 3300X. It's time to draw a few conclusions and start to wrap this one up. I guess we should start with addressing the main question. If you've got about $120 US to spend on a CPU, should you buy a new Ryzen 3 3300X, assuming you can find one of course, or instead snap up a second-hand Ryzen 7 1700? Based on the data, I really do have to recommend the 3300X for gamers, and to be more specific, gamers who plan on doing nothing but gaming. It's a bit like the 7700K and 1700 comparison we've seen previously when we first reviewed the 3300X, that it is very similar to the 7700K in terms of gaming performance. And just last week, we found that the 7700K is still faster than the Ryzen 7 1700 for gaming for the most part, and therefore is still the better choice for gamers. And by that logic, that would mean that the 3300X is a better choice than the Ryzen 7 1700 for gamers. Given the results, it is hard to pick the 1700 over the 3300X for gaming exclusively, given there were a number of instances where the Ryzen 3 processor was 20, 30, and even up to 40% faster. So that being the case, I'd personally pick the Ryzen 3 3300X at this price point, but I'm also not confident enough to say that it will be the best option in a few years' time. Partly because we don't actually have a crystal ball, but also because the early indicators that we do have suggest that that might not be the case. The more demanding titles, such as Shadow of the Tomb Raider, do see very high utilization with the 3300X, and this sees the 1700 able to deliver better 1% low performance. So if we get a game that pushes utilization, say 20% higher, while also spreading the load evenly across all cores, that could push performance strongly in favor of the older 8-core processor. Of course, you can also overclock the 1700, which is not something we explored in this particular video, and that will naturally improve performance in CPU-limited scenarios, but you can also overclock the 3300X, and at that point it just becomes an OC arms race. It's also worth noting that if you happen to be using a graphics card sporting an RTX 2060, RX 5700, or perhaps a slower GPU, then in many instances you won't actually notice a difference between these two CPUs, particularly if you like to crank up the visual quality settings. That being the case, it might actually pay to invest in the R7 1700 now, in the hope that by the time you do upgrade to a more powerful GPU, games are heavily utilized in the 1700, and if that is the case, the 3300X will be struggling, likely suffering from poor frame time performance, which will result in noticeable frame stutters. But as I said earlier, it's very hard to know how this comparison will play out over the next few years. A lot of it is game dependent, but all I can promise you is that we will compare them again next year, the year after that, and many, many more years to come. And that is going to do it for this one. If you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, do that stuff. We also have our Patreon account, access to our monthly live stream, which will be coming up possibly next week, Q&As, behind the scenes videos, and our exclusive Discord chat for Harbor Unboxed Patreon members only. Anyway, if you're interested, the link is in the video description. But other than that, just thank you very much for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.